And I'll tell you once we're live. Give it a minute.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you once we're live. Right. Give it a minute. Oh, is it just? Yeah, hi. Great. So it's coming up to 10 a.m. on Friday. Is it the 15th of? I can't even keep up with the dates now. And I'm at a coffee with Manny with none other than Peter Higginbottom from Planning Insight. So welcome, Peter.
Hi, Manny.
Thanks very much for giving up your time this morning. And as I can imagine, it's pretty crazy time for all planning consultants with all the changes that are coming about.
Yeah, it's been quite a busy last year and straight into this year as well, really busy.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time. And what I thought was I'll take the opportunity to just really have a chat with you, see where the opportunities are and challenges are for SME developers like myself, and really, just a chat. So if I could kick off and just sort of say that, back in sort of 2020, Boris Johnson announced this big, massive build program. And as our target, technically on paper, is 300,000 houses a year. Is that correct? The government target?
It is, yeah. They've set an aspiration to achieve 30,000 dwellings a year to meet the
2020 Boris Johnson announced. Right. And so do you have any views on that, generally speaking? I know we've also had a massive setback in COVID times. Do you have a general sort of viewpoint on that?
I mean, yeah, it's a massive step. That I don't think any year has ever achieved even 250,000. So to then deliver another 50,000, and this is not planning permissions. This is units on the ground. Massive step up for the whole industry. If the government actually sorted out the real opportunity for SME developers to grow, there was a massive decline in SME developers and the growth of the big six house builders, and the only way they're going to achieve that number is through SME support.
So why do you think that's been then? Is it partly because of planning?
I think partly because of everything. And then there was just a tendency for the house builders to lobby government and get everything they want. So all the support was just directed towards the big players, all the help to buy stuff. That money just went into the big pots, and SMEs were just left to sort of pick up the pieces and scrabble around with what they could. But historically, SME developers have done far more housing than some of the individual house builders. So let's hope that continues.
So I think that's why this build, part of it is to do with encouraging SME developers. And I remember briefly, I was part of, with the Trusted Land hat on, we were part of this talk to Robert Jendrick, the housing minister, and he was literally speaking to SME developers like us saying, how can we help you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's really positive that the door was open for you guys to go along. And I certainly think that some of the things that you guys articulated will come through in changes. Problem is that the big lobbyists also have a large voice and large political donations. So the cynic in me thinks that I worry that they'll still look to support the major house builders.
But look, let's talk from an SME perspective. And where do you think in the build program itself are the sort of top opportunities for us?
Yeah, I mean, Build was very much an aspirational speech that has then been sort of translated into consultation documents and possible reform. I mean, a big play by this government is permitted development. They've made no apologies for that over the years. It's been very unpopular in some circles, but they've committed through the long-awaited upwards extensions, which has been consulted on repeatedly over the years, and they just struggled to grapple with it. I think they used the pandemic as the opportunity to say we need to support the industry. So we've got a lot of upwards extensions in there.
That's the airspace, right?
The airspace stuff, yeah. That they've talked about for some time. It's the difficulty has been how do you put it on paper, and what they've done is okay. It's got some issues with it in terms of how the legislation's written, but they have very much made a key play to try and boost housing supply through permitted development, because it gives some certainty when you're acquiring sites. There's a lot of you guys and others when you're looking at sites, you're looking at PD opportunities, knowing what you can deliver as a minimum, and then anything else above is a kind of enhancement and a kind of boost to profits. So it does provide that certainty, which is helpful.
So just to sort of simplify this, build, part of it is permitted development as a main theme for SME developers, and part of that is the airspace. Now, have you had any experience of doing any airspace applications for your clients?
Yeah, I mean, we've done airspace previously before it was PD, with some success. It's always a challenge, partly from a design point of view, from a construction point of view, as well as other impacts. But we have had some success across London. We have several of the new applications in progress at the moment, both submitted, in preparation. We've had one determination, which we were expecting, but was refused.
So what was that? Was that above offices, flats? What was it?
So it's a detached block of flats that we saw an extension for an additional story, an additional 2 units. We had a previous planning application refused on design grounds, so we were kind of half expecting a similar decision, because a lot of authorities are not fond of it. They've resisted, and through the consultation documents, they were not happy that it was coming in, and so they've used whatever prior approval matters to refuse. I mean, research that we've undertaken in London is that I think only 12% of determined applications have been approved for upward extensions so far. Yeah, there's a number that are undetermined yet, but so far it's only 12, and some councils are far more favourable than others.
So technically, the PD for the air story or airspace is a lot more complicated than just the PD, which was the old permitted development from office to resi, because that had like 3 or 4 aspects, like flood, contamination, and noise. But there's a lot more aspects to this particular PD now, right?
Yeah, it's exactly that. So they, you correctly point out, the other classes had a sort of very narrowed prior approval matters for consideration, and the latest Part 20 and the airspace ones have expanded those matters for consideration. So they include design, neighbouring amenity. There's also to do with fire access, compliance, and that design one in particular is very, very subjective. So that the application that we've had that was refused was actually refused on scale, which we don't think is a relevant consideration, but without any clear guidance about what is, which often comes through appeal decisions and comes through the courts. So we are appealing it. Authorities have got quite a wide remit to include whatever the hell they like, and so it's us as planning consultants trying to force that focus down into what the matters really are. But yeah, it's a very, very wide open net for the authority.
Subjective, isn't it? It could be different from even the same council, one planning officer to another, typically.
It is, yeah, and that's why you're seeing some authorities kind of just accepting that this is coming, and to some extent, some of them are using it just as an opportunity to say, look, as long as the development's okay, we'll approve it. It's adding more housing supply, which councils are in an obligation to do. They've got their own housing numbers to meet. You know, that 300,000 houses that we've talked about is spread across the country in different authorities, and urban areas are expected to take the biggest uplift of that 300,000.
Okay, so going back and looking, I'm taking you back every time to the opportunities here. So again, from an SME developer's point of view, you have airspace above blocks of flats, terraced houses, terraced mixed-use building, where the 12% that were approved. Do you have any rough idea of what sort of things that they actually went for? Was it detached blocks of flats or offices? Those were approved?
So I haven't done that drilling down, but the ones that I've seen are mostly detached blocks.
Of flats or offices?
Flats, mostly detached blocks of flats. I think that's that which is a Class A under Part 20.
That's the new Class A against the Build program. What my question to you on that one is, Peter, isn't it tricky to actually convert? So let's say you've got 2-story block of flats. How do you then, what about like, the roof, you have to create another story. So wouldn't you be disturbing the lessees or the owners on the flats on the top floor?
Yeah. I mean, you raise an absolute critical point that
you have to raise the roof, right?
Yeah, you effectively, you could be, if it's a flat building, you could just be adding a lightweight structure on top as an additional story, which was quite becoming more common practice before permitted development. Equally, I mean, if it's a pitch roof, then you've got to take the roof off, or you've got to potentially dormer it, or you've got to
So
do
flat
something.
roof might be better than pitch roof in this case then.
You want a flat roof, probably more than off. But it's so planning's one of those things. But as you raise, it's also to do with, you know, have they got the right to do it? Have the leaseholders got the right to object to what you want to do, which is nothing to do with planning. And before you're even dealing with that as well, you've also got to understand, well, will a building take an additional story?
Support, right? The engineering, the steels, is it going to support another story or two stories? So I think from my point of view as an SME developer, I'd say it's definitely not low-hanging fruit. It's a lot more complex than you think it is. But maybe blocks of offices would be great. I think that's a very good opportunity, I think, for us.
There can be, yeah. So detached. I mean, detached are the best because you've got less restrictions on the a number of stories you can go up. Terrace buildings are pegged back by the heights of the other buildings, so it may not be possible to do any on some of the taller buildings. So if you're looking at terrace properties, it should be the lowest story in a
Okay.
terrace.
So, so I'm just going to do a shout out actually. I've got James and Chani here. So hi, James. And James has got a question. So shall we take that question now, Peter?
Yeah, go for it.
So James is like, great discussion. Is planning easier in councils who haven't met their housing targets easier? And how do you find the council's current achievement against target?
So on the first point, to a degree, yes, there's something that's known as the tilted balance. So if a council doesn't meet its 5-year housing land supply, the weight you give to their local plan policies is often reduced. It's not a slam dunk, but it does kind of create a little bit of an opportunity to push things through. What it usually does is makes things that are perhaps more intensive, more achievable than necessarily a site that shouldn't get planning permission in any circumstances suddenly gets planning permission. However, there's also the fact that those councils that haven't met their housing supply, there's a reason for that, and it's not always because they're difficult. It's the political situation can be difficult, and they don't care about housing numbers. They want to resist it, so they often still make it difficult, which means that you often have to go to appeal in those circumstances, which is an important consideration if you're looking at a site and options in terms of your program.
Thanks for that, Peter. I think James was asking, how do you find their achievement against target? Is there like a easier way to do it on the council website?
Yeah, a lot of Google and the right words. So councils are required to publish a housing supply document. So the best thing to search is the council name and then the words 5-year housing land supply.
Okay, so
They're
James,
not always up to date.
housing land supply. Sorry, Peter.
That's all right. They're not always up to date. There are other statistics as well that are relevant, which is the housing delivery test, which is published by the government, which is the number of units that are completed. And there's a threshold with which all councils must meet, which is this year, well, November last year was supposed to go up quite significantly in terms of the threshold. So if you don't deliver, I think if you're 75%
Under
your target, then you face the presumption, which is that tilted balance I've talked about. We have covered off some of the council areas around London.
Actually, I was going to say, James, you might go onto Planning Insight website. I know I've received a few of those from you because I've obviously on your mailing list. So, James, just another quick tip. If you go onto Planning Insight, is it .co.uk, Peter?
Planninginsight.co.uk. I can share the link. There's something we'll call it's called our Insights Hub. And we've got a number of PD guidance documents in there, use class guidance, but we've also dealt with about 6 or 7 counties housing land supply. We are going to update those this year, and we are going to release some more as well. So it'll be worth checking out our website, signing up to our newsletter, and you'll get notified when they get published.
Fantastic. James, I hope you've got that and hope that's been useful for you. Hi, Bushra. We've got a couple more people joining us. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And please do keep your questions coming in. So we're going to continue this discussion with Peter. And so far, we've talked about how the Build program has influenced permitted development rights, and airspace is more of a thin version of a planning application. Would you agree, Peter?
Absolutely, yeah. You still need a hell of a lot of the stuff. One of the tips was about you still need a good consultant team. You obviously need a good planning consultant, in my view.
Absolutely.
You need a good architect because design is a critical factor. You may or may not need a transport consultant, a daylight consultant, and depending on the risks, flood risk or contaminated land as well. So there's a lot that still needs to go into this, and it's yeah, as you said, I think you hit the nail right on the head. It's very unlikely to be low hanging fruit. There's a few that are,
I'd
but
say a detached block of offices is something that I would personally look at, and I'm looking at one or two at the minute to see if it works. And really, I think your key thing is to developing a good relationship with the planning consultant and working out, what those opportunities are. Because often, as an SME developer, we don't know the planning as well as you do, or near enough, right? We're just sort of guessing. And really, what we really want is a certainty of knowing rather than just making guesses.
I think so, yeah. And I think the value we add as well is that we're not always looking at the very, very local level. We're looking at the national picture in terms of what's coming out in terms of appeal decisions, what's coming out in case law that can have a direct impact on every local authority. Particularly with the new Part 20, we will get appeal decisions over the next 6 months that start to focus down what inspectors think the legislation actually means.
Yeah.
And from there, we can provide even more clarity. But because we're able to track that, we're able to offer that advice as part and parcel of our service.
And what about the press? There was design codes coming up. What's the status of that?
So in terms of design code, so this was part of the bigger picture of planning for the future consultation that took place at the end of last year, which I think was largely around you going in to meet Robert Jenrick. That was to do with the major reform of the planning system. So the idea that they would speed up the local plan making decision, that there would be design codes brought in. So any site that was allocated would effectively have permission in terms of its allocation, and then in order to build out, you just have to adhere to these design codes. It's a bit more like a zonal system, which would set out kind of parameters of the heights, the size, the mix of units. It would probably be very, very prescriptive. Other countries do it. We've never really done it. There's a few developments though that have done it. There's a few interesting ones. I think over near Bicester, there's a major site there where they've got a design code for self-build.
Yes.
So it would follow something like that, and they're very, very detailed, and they just say, here's a sheet, follow this, and you've got planning. So they can work, but they don't, as a mass built development, I'm not sure they work across the piece because they do end a bit bland.
So is that now been agreed, or that's still in consultation?
No, so that's part of so the consultation was carried out last year. The responses have gone in. The government is in theory considering the consultation responses and how to respond.
And what did you mean?
Tied up.
Sorry, go
on. It's also tied in with this housing number and where they're targeting putting housing, which we saw the 300,000 number bounded around. They picked where through this algorithm, the enemy of this government is using algorithms, and they've responded by changing where they're going to put the housing numbers. So there is a lot of pushback, and from often the Tory party itself, that might result in some of these proposed major reforms being watered down. So I think design codes might be a step too far, that they probably won't go down. They'll probably just try and tinker with the existing system, but
So they won't adopt the design codes, you think?
I think it's unlikely they will go down a design code, and if they do, it will take years to implement.
Okay, and what about you mentioned something allocated sites? What does that mean?
So this was the idea that all the land would be effectively designated into zones of growth, of retain or protect. So, which to some extent it is at the moment. Urban areas are in that kind of growth area. You would have those that are kind of in between, and then the protection are the greenbelt type.
AONB and Greenbelt and all that.
So there was the idea that if you're in the growth area, you've already established the principle of development subject to following these design codes. It's quite a significant step, and it could boost supply in the long term. I think the short term, the market and the planning industry would have to react to it. But I think there is already a system in place that does something like that, which is the permission in principle. That was brought in years ago, that is nearly never used.
Yeah, why? Why is that so? Why we never use permission in principle? PIP.
I just think because it's. I think people think that it's as long a process as full application, and sometimes if you've got a site, you have to do the detail to understand how you could maximize it. I mean, I think, Manny, you'll know when you get a good architect suddenly finds you space that you never even imagined you had. And you don't get that from just drawing a box on a page and assuming. More often than not, with things like outlines, unless they are detailed, big, major schemes, and this permission in principle, you end up actually limiting the amount of development because nobody's comfortable with granting too much on a site if they don't know exactly what they're going to get at the end.
Right. Okay. So when is a decision going to be made on all the growth areas, the retain, the protect, all of those things? When is the decisions going to be made on those?
We don't have any dates from government whatsoever at the moment. There were 2 consultations run at the same time. One was for the major reform, one was for a few tweaks to the system, including housing numbers. We would expect the tweaks to the system ones to come out more rapidly, and we would expect them in the spring this year. We've also got some more permitted development changes, I think, coming in the spring, which is probably what they're going to focus on.
Yeah.
And we also have to recognise that the government's still dealing with a massive crisis in the COVID pandemic.
Yes,
so
there's a lot going on.
priorities do have to shift somewhat. So I think planning reform is probably on the back burner for major planning reform is probably on the back burner for most of this year.
Right.
But more PD and certainly some tinkering in terms of housing numbers, affordable housing thresholds could be on the horizon, which was another change that was.
At the minute it's 10. So basically, just for the listeners or viewers, the current affordable housing threshold is 10 units, generally speaking, nationally, except for some councils I know, like Reading, have gone against the government, in fact, almost, right? I don't know how the system works, but now they've got their own little system where they can ask for contributions under 10 units.
They do, yeah. There's a number of authorities, mostly in the southeast, that will have lower thresholds based on evidence that they are less affordable than other parts of the country. Reading is less affordable than Newcastle, for example. So that's how they base it on a local level, which is how they're able to justify deviating from national policy. The government has suggested maybe raising that threshold from 10 to 40 or 50 in its consultation. I think that was a higher number than most of us in the industry were expecting. So I think they're likely to come down. We've heard 25 mooted as a kind of threshold. I think that would probably give significant supply boost and significant confidence to SME developers, that because there's a number of sites we look at that there's always a debate from a developer about, is it worth jumping over that threshold to then have to elongate the planning process to deal with the viability issues, because the reality is most sites for 10 or 11 units will not take affordable housing on site, but you end up through this very long drawn out process. So in raising the threshold could release many thousands of units each year.
Okay, well, that's great. I also remember, as part of my discussions with Robert Jendrick, a lot of small developers were pushing for complete stop to this whole viability and threshold malarkey, as they called it. And I think they wanted a separate, very cleaner system whereby if you know you're building, say, 20 units or whatever, then you have a standard number. It's like a set number already agreed or something like that. I wasn't sure how exactly it was going to work, but is that correct?
Yeah, they were trying to work out. It's trying to build certainty into a system, and certainty into a system speeds it up. It's just, where do you set the level, and the level will never be agreed by everybody. The London Mayor did this in a few years ago in the London Plan, where if you deliver 35%, no questions asked. They would love 50, but they'll take 35, and that kind of gives them certainty, and you build that into your process. I think what the government was suggesting was that if you had that threshold set and the number of units very clearly set out, and it would be a particular product. So I think they were talking about first homes, starter homes, so getting new first-time buyers onto the market will be a clear priority. And I think, from my understanding, the SME market is keen to deliver affordable housing of the right product in the right place.
As long as it's viable, right? As long as it's viable.
As long as it's viable, yeah. But I think when you give certainty, because one of the issues we face is that landowners' expectations are not always quite aligned. They hear build, and all they hear is pounds. And so it's very difficult for SME developers or any developer to then go in and say, yeah, it's great, but this is the viability of the scheme as is, and articulating that. I think where the expectations are set very, very clear by government policy or and hopefully the media, they will understand of where their value actually sits, and that should facilitate developments coming forward.
Yeah, brilliant. So there's another question from Bushra. So Bushra, thanks for your question. It is, how detailed will the growth areas be specified? Is this anywhere on the council website currently?
This is a completely new idea, so it's nowhere but in the government's consultation document.
It's just in consultation at the moment, basically.
Yeah, so but the only place that this kind of growth areas are mentioned is in the consultation document itself, and there's no indication of how wide and how big they'd be.
Yeah.
I suppose that's for the next step about whether, in principle, people agree with that approach and whether the government wants to take it forward.
Yep.
I suppose the expectation would be that a settlement boundary, as you get in some parts of the country at the moment, would be an appropriate line to draw around a growth area, with perhaps some pockets taken out with some open space. That's what I expected it will be. It will be very much focused on urban areas and maybe the periphery if it's not greenbelt.
Okay, brilliant. So we've covered build. I think we've done all the other bits. Is there anything else you want to mention within that consultation before we move on to other exciting topics?
Not at the moment. I think there's as I said, there's permitted development that's coming. They've made a keen play for that. We expect that to be a key part of the overall strategy. There's talk about amending SIL and things again, but to be honest, community infrastructure levy was meant to come in to provide the certainty, and Section 106 was supposed to be on its way out, and they watered it down, and we ended up with both. So it's the worst of both worlds. But I mean, those are the main headlines, really.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that, Peter. So I think the next topic, and I think a lot of people would be interested, actually, before we go on, there's one more question. So if we take that. So James' question is, when do you think the new PD rights for Class E will come into force? 31st July. So we're just jumping onto that, James, now. And so let's move on to Class E. So in a nutshell, from little knowledge that I have, I believe Class E is very much about repurposing one type of commercial into another type of commercial. And that's to help the current situation we are in, and helping very easily to convert a shop from a retail to a cafe, or there's specific, I think, 5 or 6 types of different categories that come into the Class E. So allowing it to just move from one to the other without the need of any applications, any prior approval or whatsoever. So it might be better coming with you. What's Class E then, Peter?
You've pretty much explained it absolutely in their head. It's a flexible commercial use, in effect, all bundled together. So the A classes, some of the B, which are the employment classes, some of the old D classes, which were the kind of leisure and sort of medical non-institutional stuff, all packaged together so that buildings can change between uses, but then also have a mix together, because you would have some scenarios where you might have a bar and a shop and a cafe, and you'd end up needing planning permission for all of those. It became quite complicated. Now you can just bundle it pretty much all in together. I say a bar, but because that pubs are separate. But it's a flexible use class that just allows, ideally, the behind it was that it allows the high street to kind of keep functioning and thrive.
Yeah. I mean, so James's question is very relevant now. He's saying, when do the PD rights? Because obviously, moving from one commercial to the other is also great for small developers like us, especially when we're looking to do shops and uppers, or converting the back of the shops, or when we're looking to get a new tenant in a vacant shop, right? What most developers are interested in is when will the Class E be allowed to become conversion into residential as permitted development?
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, that's also still actually subject to an open consultation. So if you're interested in it, by all means, get on there and submit your responses to the government, whether you support it or you've got concerns about it. So it's a live consultation at the moment. The only thing we know for certain is that Class E was brought in, but in doing so, there were problems because we've still got PD that refers to the old classes. So they had transitional arrangements that run to the end of July. So we know that basically all PD, whether it's O, M, G, amongst others, will just end in July. The PD will just run out unless they do something. So they're consulting on the moment. Traditionally, most legislation comes out in April. I expect in April we will get the new amended PD rights, certainly published. Whether they don't come in, they might only come into effect sort of months afterwards, but they will definitely be before July, and I think probably April.
April, May. So published in April with possibly another month for it to then go live, possibly.
Yeah, they may do March to April, but I think April will be the key date that we'll know by.
Okay, and this is where you so the old one still continues. So office to residential, which is the 58-day deemed consent, will still continue till. So you'd have to get your applications in, let's say, 2 months prior.
Yeah, at the
At the
moment
very
you need
latest,
to
the
be.
very latest, right?
At the moment, you need to be planning that any application will be determined by the 31st of July in case the government doesn't bring in the new legislation. I think that's unlikely, but the new Class E obviously is something that will probably come in before that date. But we don't know exactly what they're proposing to do. They've in the consultation document themselves, they've still talked about prior approval. So we expect some prior approval will be required. We don't know where the interesting one will be Class G, which at the moment, so your conversion of uppers above retail into up to 2 residential units is not subject to any approval process whatsoever.
You have to put any application in at all
Don't need an application at all. Many people will do a certificate of lawfulness
after you've converted it.
or before. Some people do it before, just to get that confirmation. It's one of those things that, if you're going to sell them on, then most people will want the certificate anyway for other purposes.
For legal
So
purposes.
I don't know whether that will still remain. One thing that has obviously come in is minimum space standards. So any application that's submitted before, I think it's the 5th of April, doesn't have to comply with the space standards. Any application submitted afterwards or any development carried out afterwards, so that includes Class G, will have to comply with the minimum space standards of 37 square meters for the smallest unit.
That's right.
Size. So that will continue in the new Class E, and which is why we probably expect it will be April, because there's an interesting date there in terms of a cutoff. So, but we don't know whether Class O at the moment doesn't apply in conservation areas. They've been mooted about whether that would continue, so whether you can still convert offices in conservation areas, but you've got the implication of ground floor premises on high streets being able to convert. So there may be a prior approval process that will come in. Another thing as well,
at the moment, Class O is the 56-day deemed consent.
Yeah, 56-day office to resi, yeah. But we also don't know where they're going to go in terms of the deemed consent. So the Part 20, because the upwards extensions don't have a deemed date on them. They just have a target date, whereas O and M do have 56 days deemed consent. So we don't know whether they will continue to apply that deemed consent. I suspect they will. I suspect they will include conversion applications. It probably will be that they'll open it up to all of them.
So just going back then, so airspace has no deemed consent, but it's like an 8-week typical timescale.
Yeah, it's the same target date as a planning application.
Right. So at the moment, the only things that do have deemed consent is Class O and Class M.
For the residential retail high street.
Up till the 31st of July. So Class O is where you do shops with 2 flats above, and M is at the back of the shop.
Class O is your office to resi.
Sorry, yeah.
Class M is your retail to resi, up to 150 square meters.
At the back.
And it doesn't have to be at the back, actually. A lot of people do it at the back. It doesn't have to be.
So where could it be then?
We can do the front. You could technically do the front. You could do upstairs. You could do a combination. But Class G is definitely the uppers. It has to be the upper floors.
So M, just quickly to clarify, M is not just the back of the shop. You could actually convert the shop itself into residential as well.
In theory, it's just one of the considerations is impact on the high street. So an obvious strategy that many people undertake is to just retain a smaller shop at the front and do it at the back. But it's not a requirement of the legislation itself. It's a way of getting over that prior approval matter. But I mean, one thing I did predict the end of last year was that I thought the 150 square meter threshold would increase because it was overly restrictive. I think it didn't have to be set that low. Another interesting factor as well is that so Class M, you can do certain what's known as operational development. So you can do certain building works, external works. So you can put your new front door in, separate the shop out, things like that. Class O, the office to resi, doesn't have any operational development. And so you're stuck having to do a planning application. I think what's likely under Class E is that we will get a complete combined both operational development and also the change of use.
Operational development is where you have any external changes to the external facade.
Yeah, it's building works, new building, demolishing buildings, amending buildings. So where they do introduce that, though, they're likely to introduce a prior approval consideration rather than just letting people build it. Some of the other classes, I think it's class Q, and some of the other agricultural classes, the prior approval considerations only come in if you're doing building works. So they could do a split where you could do a class O to resi, an office to residential conversion, where they say, or a high street class E to residential. And if it's just the change of use, only these prior approval matters are for consideration. If you are doing building works, then that's the only bit that's considered in terms of design policies and such like. So they could split it, but we'll have to wait and see. They probably don't know yet.
Yeah, they're still, because they've got the middle of the pan. There's so much other things going on right now. So really, we've covered Class E. We've covered the fact that Class E is going to become residential, but we're not quite sure how that's going to exactly shape up. But as you said, combination of all the things you mentioned, some prior approval for change of use, but other bits will have maybe operational development might be allowed.
I think that you'll be allowed to do operational development subject to approval of it.
Yeah. Okay. So there's lots of different things that you have to consider, obviously, but we don't know exactly what that's going to be until it's announced, hopefully in the sort of late spring this year.
What's likely to happen, Manny, I think, is where you've got Class M, Class G, and Class O, all the best bits will probably be merged together.
Yeah, which we hope so, right? Yeah, brilliant. Well, listen, so on that note, then, what are the top 3 low-hanging fruit or a top 2 low-hanging fruit for SME developers in your view? What should we be looking at? Because there's so much, there's so much overwhelmed by SME developers, and we're not planning consultants. We need to have a plan. And in that plan, what should we be looking for sites that are, potential good opportunities?
Yeah, we've mentioned it already, detached buildings. I think detached flats or detached commercial buildings probably lend themselves the most opportunities, and it won't be a single opportunity. What we're finding is that it's applying multiple PD or planning strategies to the same building to really maximize the value. So we've got a number of buildings we're looking at the moment that are office to resi. Due to the occupation of the building, we're doing an upwards extension to add more units, and then we'll probably be going in for planning to add a side extension for more units. So it's using all the combination of all the tricks in the shed to really squeeze as many units out of the site.
Okay, that's a really good tip. And again, I think stressing the point of using a planning consultant, and I think I can't stress that enough, guys. It's an investment that you would need to make in your business in order to highlight, as Peter said, a combination of permitted development, prior approval opportunities, and maximize the potential for that site. Because there's only so much we can see, and we know our knowledge as a developer is limited because that's not what we do for a living, but that's what you do for a living, right? So that's your sort of exactly what you can see. And anything else apart from the detached blocks of flats and office buildings?
There's another point I raise as well, which is SIL, which a lot of people miss out on. Just because it's PD doesn't mean it's not liable for SIL.
It is liable?
Yeah, it can be. It's all about occupancy, whether it's been lawfully occupied for 6 months in the last 3 years. And it's also about additional floor space. So if you extend a building and you're doing new units, then it's partly still liable. So that's a factor that we consider in all our planning advice, that what are the SIL implications. And we've had a few instances where we've had developers doing changes of use, and we've gone in and advised on the right strategy in terms of which bits you build out first, and save people tens of thousands of pounds on their SIL liability. So I'd hope that we earn our keep.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm using, just to let you know, guys, I'm using Peter on quite a few applications at the minute. And, so I think the other thing is, so SIL is, I was speaking to another direct to vendor, and in Bracknell, it's £480 per square meter, the SIL. It's crazy, isn't it?
It's huge money. Yeah, we did them. I did one in London actually a while ago where the SIL liability was calculated incorrectly, and the client bought the site. I looked at it, worked it out, responded to the authority, and saved them £174,000.
Wow,
Just
that's a
because
lot of money. That's bottom line, isn't it?
it wasn't, it wasn't that I pulled the wool over anyone's eyes. I wasn't being naughty. But it should be right.
You
That's
should pay for what you really ought to be paying, not over and above what you need to pay, right?
fair. So that's the two we do. But equally, we will impose strategies in order to mitigate civil liabilities where it's possible. So that's something that there's probably the other thing as well to consider, which is you talked about in terms of the value of a planning consultant. I think it's the value of everybody. We talk about the dream team, and most developers will have the right, more seasoned developers will certainly have the same people that they go to. So planning consultant, architects, it's good to have sometimes a pool of consultants. But transport consultant, daylight, have these people ready, and it's often not worth skimping on them when you're doing an application. Sometimes it is just worth, we'll look at something and say, oh, it's a bit questionable in terms of impact on daylight. So some people will say, I won't spend the money on it and I'll risk it. And it's great, but if it gets refused on it, you've just wasted 16 weeks. You're going to have to pay application fees again, potentially. You're going to have to pay planning. It's more costly sometimes than just spending another £1,500, £2,000 on a daylight consultant that's just going to literally hit that nail on the head. It makes the life of the planning officer easy. I can see they've considered it, done. Let's move on.
It's out of the way. It's been considered, like you said. So I think development needs some burn money, right? So I think unless you're ready to take some of those and make those investments up front, I think, like you said, save you a lot of pain later on in the day.
It can do, yeah. But I mean, that's where the planning consultant, I think, comes in as well. We'll advise on what we think is necessary, both from a validation point of view and also from what our understanding of how an authority deals with applications. Do they care normally? Do they let things go? What's our experience of the officers? We bring all that to the table from our experience. And also we can be forceful because we know the law, we know policies, we know how councils should and do operate. So, if we say you need a report, more often than not, you need it. And it's worth doing.
And the key thing, Peter, I've just realized as well is prior approval is moving towards a slimmer planning application anyway. So I think they're trying to, take it down that route. And I think before, where there was opportunities like Class O, Office to Resi, where you can just do deemed consent, and there are very few things that they were considering. Now it's going to get more and more, right?
It's partly been borne out by this desire and urge to get the PD out during the pandemic, and the legislation is not the best drafted, to put it mildly. And so in order to get it over the line and not get Parliament kicking up a stink, although there were legal challenges, they had to give these assurances that there was still an approval process. I think they've probably given too much away, or certainly not narrowed it down in terms of with clear guidance about what is for consideration. But it's almost the same as a planning application. You're absolutely right. To some degree, it can be worse because the legislation is, if you don't comply with it from a technical point of view, it's a refusal. There's no discretion whatsoever. Whereas a planning application, there can be a degree of consideration and weighing up the relevant considerations. So it's absolutely critical you get it right.
No, absolutely. So, Peter, I've just taken the liberty to put your email on the live stream. James was asking us, can we get in touch with you for help on a development project? So I think it's peter@planninginsight.co.uk, if it's correct. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, or info at Planning
What's your website? www.planninginsight.co.uk.
Yeah, that's right.
Brilliant. I think we're pretty much there. Peter, I really, really appreciate your time today from your busy schedule. And thank you very much. We've had loads of listeners, lots of few questions, obviously. And I will monitor the live stream actually as we go along. And if there are more questions, and if I don't know the answers, I'll come back to you if that's okay. But on that note, thank you so much, Peter. Really, really enjoyed this coffee session.